Hi, I'm Professor Martin Bunch. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change and one of the teaching team on your C4 capstone course. I figured I'd give you a picture to go with the voiceover of these PowerPoint slides. So that's me. And by the way, that's our Las Nubes Biological Reserve down in Costa Rica that we operate out of York University. So the idea is to introduce you to the concept of stakeholders and how to engage with them. And here's a definition that comes from my field, but is generally applicable across all fields. And that is that a stakeholder is generally considered to be a person or group directly affected by or with an interest in a decision or with a legal responsibility and authority relative to a decision. So there's a lot of work on the idea of engagement with stakeholders in a variety of different disciplines. For example, there's something called stakeholder theory that's related to the business side of things, organizational management and business ethics. Certainly in planning and social science and social work and municipal governance, and there's all kinds of disciplines and professional fields that need to know about and engage with stakeholders. And there's a pretty straightforward summary of how to go about engaging and identifying stakeholders. That's generally called stakeholder mapping, and broadly involves identifying who the stakeholders are in your particular situation, basically brainstorming and developing a list of stakeholders to prioritize them and to represent them in some way. But identify and prioritize on what basis? So, for example, you may identify stakeholders and prioritize them on the basis of their needs and their relative importance with relation to your project, maybe on stakeholder expectations based on value hierarchies. And this is something specific that has to do with identifying values such as things like benevolence and self-direction, universalism, which are generally more important than things like security and conformity, achievement, hedonism, and followed by power, tradition, stimulation values. These are a prioritization that was found by Schwartz and Barty, 2001, when they're looking at value hierarchies across cultures. So there's all kinds of work out there on this kind of thing. So you need to find some way to identify and prioritize your stakeholders. Now there's a number of ways, specific methodologies that different fields use to try to understand and map their stakeholders. For example, here's one that was originally proposed by Collin and Ackerman in their book, Making Strategy. This particular representation I've taken from Murray Webster and Simon. And they construct a matrix that use dimensions of power and influence and interest and support for your project to try and place their stakeholders in categories. And this comes after brainstorming of a list of who the stakeholders might be. And that allows a business manager, for example, that's interested in developing, say, a new project or establishing a new facility, guides them into how to engage with their stakeholders. For example, you may just simply want to keep people informed, or you might want to work more closely with them in a partnership kind of a way. Another model, again from the business side, is called the salience model that categorizes stakeholders into 8 different stakeholder types based on dimensions of legitimacy. What legitimacy do they have to engage in decision making? What power might they wield in that situation, and the urgency of their needs. And so that divides people into discretionary stakeholders, dormant stakeholders, demanding, dominant, dangerous, dependent, or definitive. So all starting with a D, different kinds of stakeholders that have different levels of power, legitimacy, and urgency. Note the last item here as well, which is non-stakeholders. You need to draw a line around your problem space, and identify who's in and who's out. And this is it has to be a really considered decision. because this is where people can be marginalized and excluded rather than included and empowered in a variety of different kinds of processes. Now, again, from my field, environmental management, Bruce Mitchell identifies several modes of stakeholder engagement. One is a partnership, which is a mutually agreed arrangement between two or more public, private, or non-governmental organizations to jointly achieve a vision or a goal or an objective, and jointly participate in activity for the benefit of something, in this case, environment and society. So that's a formal agreement and a formal arrangement. Then there's participation, which normally means that there's individuals and groups that are involved in the design and evaluation of an initiative, but they don't necessarily contribute to the actual decision-making or implementation, which is in contrast to engagement, which includes significant and meaningful involvement of stakeholders in decision-making and implementation processes that might or will affect them. Now here's an idea associated with the planning field that is kind of a foundational idea when talking about public participation. This is something that was put out by Sherry Arnstein way back in 1969 called a ladder of citizen participation. And she identified several categories of participation, from non-participation through to degrees of tokenism through to citizen power. And they have to do with how people and organizations are actually engaged in a process. So, for example, things like non-participation, manipulation, and therapy could be things like, a rubber stamping committee, or power holders that educate or try to cure the citizens of some problem, or progressing to tokenism. Things like citizen rights and options might be identified, or consultation, citizens might be heard but not necessarily heeded, or placation, advice might be received from citizen but not really acted upon, up through to actual degrees of citizen power, which might be stuff like partnerships where trade-offs are negotiated among partners, delegated power where citizens are given management power for selected or all parts of programs, or full citizen control. Now, these are the things that you need to consider when you're working in real world projects with real people. You're trying to get things done. And it has to do also with the stage at which people are actually engaged in a project. So if you are engaging people at the beginning of the project, you're envisioning what the problem is and what needs to be done, that implies more power to people that are helping to form the nature of the program or the solution, rather than just simply developing a plan and then informing people of them, letting people know what the plan is, and then maybe soliciting feedback at that point. But at that point, the plan is already made. So I'm going to give you an example of one technique that can be used in stakeholder analysis. And this is part of a larger methodology called soft systems methodology, which is an action research methodology that was originally developed by a guy named Peter Checkland. This picture here is a representation of the whole methodology, in which a real world problem situation or problematic situation is identified, and the methodology develops models of purposeful human activity that are then used in various ways to structure debate about change, finding accommodations among stakeholder groups, which leads to an idea that can be implemented to improve the situation. And the whole thing is kind of iterative. Now, the technique I'm going to talk about uses a mnemonic called CATWO to build what's known as a root definition of the situation. And in this methodology, you develop a lot of these root definitions. So you work through this CATWO mnemonic from the perspective of multiple different stakeholders, and each of those develop a root definition that is the core of the system from the perspective of a particular stakeholder. I'll give you some examples, but first I want to walk you through this mnemonic. So the mnemonic has 6 components: customer, actor, transformation, worldview, owner, and environment. The customer is who the system is operated for, the victim or beneficiary of the system. Actors are those people or groups or organizations that actually do things that transform something to something else. And these transformations are processes that are operated to do something. The transformation itself converts an input into an output, and each CATWO and root definition identifies just a single transformation. The worldview is the view that makes that transformation worthwhile in this context, and the owner is the person or the organization or the group or the company that has power to destroy the system, to implement the solution, things like that. And the environment are the constraints that may prevent the system from operating, the conditions within which the system operates in general, the wider system. So here's an example of the transformation idea. This is something that needs to be identified sort of upfront in order to build this CATWO definition. And this is done from the perspective of a particular stakeholder. So here we've got 7 different transformations, and these are associated with 7 different stakeholders in a situation. So for example, one transformation from the perspective of a pedestrian might be the number 2 here, the pedestrians that are at risk safety-wise to pedestrians that are safer from risk. So the transformation that's happening in the situation is pedestrians at risk to safer pedestrians. And notice that this is not a description at this point of the situation as it is, but it involves a little bit of envisioning of where this particular stakeholder would like to see the situation go. Another one might be an environmental group. So they look at the environmental problems caused by cars and driving, and they bring pressure to decrease the number of cars on the road. They see a transformation to fewer numbers of cars. You might also have a situation where you've got people that are unemployed in the population, and they could be transformed into people that are employed in that situation. In this context of a complex problem of traffic, congestion, safety, economy, and environment, in this particular problem, you might have people that could be employed managing traffic, for example, or you could be transforming a downtown city area into something that's, a walkable city shopping district that might employ people. So there's a variety of different stakeholders and perspectives that could potentially be part of this situation. Now I'll give you 2 examples of these kinds of things. And so here we have the CATWO problem worked through and a root definition presented. In this case, the customers are pedestrians. The people acting are enforcement officers. The transformation has to do with penalizing parking that puts pedestrians at risk. And the worldview, or the Weltanschauung, means that pedestrian safety should have priority over driver convenience, and drivers will not consider pedestrian safety unless they fear punishment. The owner of this system, from this pedestrian perspective, is the local government, and the environment, the constraints that this system operates within are that unlimited road use is considered as a right by most drivers, and drivers have powerful political lobby groups. Any system to administer road use must be self-financing, that's another constraint, and most local government administrations regard road safety as a low priority. So those are the environmental constraints that the system is envisioned within. You put those things together and you can get a root definition of the system from the perspective of this particular stakeholder. So here's an example: a system owned by local government officials where traffic wardens punish parking, which puts pedestrians at risk, on behalf of pedestrians, because pedestrian safety should have priority over driver convenience, and drivers will not consider safety a priority unless they fear punishment. The system will operate under constraints of powerful drivers' political lobby groups who consider unlimited road use as a right, the need for self-financing system, and the low priority that local government gives road safety. So that's a systems analysis of a stakeholder's position from this CATWO technique. Here's another example within the same problem of a different stakeholder and a different perspective. So in this case, we've got the environmentalist perspective, the customer, the beneficiary or victim, it's the public, as represented by environmental lobbyists. The actors in this case are government representatives, and the transformation is to make driving less attractive than public transportation. The worldview is that the number of cars on the road is directly related to environmental degradation and public health problems. And the owner in this case is, again, the local government. In this case, the environment is seen as unlimited road use, considered a right by most drivers having powerful political lobby groups, and that financial incentives alone will affect poor drivers but not wealthy ones. So working that into a definition of the system from this perspective, we have a root definition that goes as such. This is a system owned by local government administration where local government officials make driving less attractive than public transport on behalf of environmental lobbyists among the public because the number of cars on the road is directly related to environmental degradation and public health problems, but limited by the need to find alternatives to financial incentives alone and the power of driver lobby groups. So there's two examples of the application of this CATWO technique to build root definitions from perspectives of stakeholders in a particular complex problematic situation. And this would then be used in conjunction with the development of similar root definitions using this technique of other important stakeholders in this situation to develop maybe more fully develop activity system representations, different models of the systems from each perspective, and used to compare one against the other in a participatory process where you would have environmental lobbyists and pedestrians represented and drivers represented and maybe the car companies represented and maybe the government officials from various departments represented. You'd have a conversation in a workshop environment probably where people look at these and compare them one against the other and try to understand each other's perspective and reach some kind of accommodation to intervene in that situation that would improve the situation that each of those particular stakeholders could live with. This is just one example of one technique involved with stakeholder analysis that I happen to be familiar with, but there's lots of different things out there and a little bit of research on your end will help you to identify a variety of different approaches that you could use. I encourage you to actually use an approach from a methodology that is established and can provide examples for you so that you can understand and identify and analyze the stakeholders involved in your particular project. And having said that, that's all from me for the moment. Have fun with your projects.